Welcome to Horrified Stories, where a few comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The tenant upstairs never leaves their room. When Emily Morgan first moved into her new apartment, the one-bedroom unit on the second floor of an old Victorian house, she couldn't believe her luck. The rent was affordable, the landlord seemed friendly enough, and the neighborhood was quiet. It was exactly what she needed to start over after her recent breakup. The house was divided into 3 units, Emily's, one on the ground floor and another on the top floor. Her first night was uneventful. She unpacked boxes, hung her favorite paintings, and curled up on her new couch with a cup of tea. The faint creaks and groans of the aging house felt oddly comforting. The next morning, Emily met Mr. Grayson, the elderly tenant from the ground floor. He greeted her warmly, holding a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Welcome to the house, miss," he said with a toothy grin. "Thanks, it seems like a nice place," Emily replied, knowing his kindly demeanor. "It is," he said, then hesitated. "Just be sure to keep to yourself. The other tenant upstairs doesn't take kindly to visitors." Emily blinked. "Oh, okay. Are they difficult?" "Not difficult, just private. Been living here for years, and I've never even seen their face," he said with a shrug. "They pay on time, so the landlord doesn't ask questions. Just don't let it bother you." Emily nodded, but the warning lingered in her mind. A few days later, Emily began to notice the peculiarities of living beneath the upstairs tenant. At odd hours, midnight, 3 a.m., sometimes just before dawn, she would hear faint movements, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, soft footsteps pacing back and forth, and occasionally the creak of the floorboards directly above her bed. She tried not to think much of it. After all, people had their routines. Maybe the tenant worked night shifts or was an insomniac. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. One evening, Emily decided to introduce herself. She baked a batch of cookies and headed upstairs. The hallway outside the upper apartment was dimly lit, with a faint scent of mothballs and dust. She knocked on the door. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time. I'm Emily. I just moved in downstairs and thought I'd say hello." Still, no answer. She waited for what felt like an eternity, then finally placed the plate of cookies on the ground and left. When she checked the next morning, the plate was gone. About a week later, Emily heard a new sound, something heavier, like furniture being dragged. The noise persisted for nearly an hour. Curious and slightly unnerved, she tiptoed upstairs to listen. She pressed her ear to the door and heard a low, murmuring voice. "Hello," she called out, knocking softly. The murmuring stopped abruptly. Emily's heart raced. She backed away from the door, suddenly feeling foolish. Before she could return to her apartment, a voice called out, soft and raspy, "Go away." It was the first time she had heard them speak. Disturbed, Emily decided to speak with her landlord, Mrs. Callahan. They met at a nearby cafe the next day. "Is there something wrong with the tenant upstairs?" Emily asked, trying to keep her tone light. Mrs. Callahan sighed. "You're not the first to ask. Look, they've been there for nearly 10 years. Always pay on time. Never cause any trouble. I don't know much about them, and frankly, I don't want to. As long as the rent comes in, it's not my business." Emily frowned. "But have you ever seen them? Heard anything strange?" "Once or twice," Mrs. Callahan admitted, lowering her voice. "I heard they had a tragedy years ago. Lost someone close. Maybe that's why they keep to themselves." Oh, Mrs. Callahan's words were meant to reassure her. Emily felt no comfort. One night, while scrolling through her phone in bed, Emily heard a loud thump above her. The sound startled her so much that she dropped her phone. She waited for another noise, but all was quiet. The next morning, she found something unexpected outside her door, a Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of her apartment door, taken from the hallway. Emily's blood ran cold. Emily stared at the Polaroid for what felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded as questions flooded her mind. Who had taken it? Why? And, most unsettling of all, how long had they been standing there outside her door? She inspected the photograph again. It was slightly blurred, but she could tell it had been taken at night. The faint light of the hallway cast eerie shadows, and her door looked unnervingly imposing in the grainy image. With trembling hands, she placed the photo on her kitchen counter. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors was messing with her. But the thought of Mr. Grayson pulling such a stunt felt absurd. and the reclusive tenant upstairs seemed unlikely to leave their apartment for any reason, let alone to play games. That afternoon, Emily decided she couldn't ignore the situation any longer. She marched upstairs and knocked firmly on the door. "Hello," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't know if you're trying to scare me, but it's not funny." No response. She knocked again, harder this time. "I found the photograph. If you don't, stop." Before she could finish, she heard a faint sound like a whisper. She pressed her ear to the door. The whispering continued, unintelligible and low, almost like a chant. Her stomach turned. "Listen," she said, her voice wavering. "If this keeps happening, I'm calling the police." The whispering stopped. For a moment, she thought that might be the end of it. Then came a single word, spoken so softly she almost didn't catch it. "Leave." Emily stumbled back, her pulse racing. She didn't wait for more. She bolted down the stairs, slamming the door to her apartment behind her. Later that evening, there was a knock on her door. Emily jumped, clutching her chest. She peered through the peephole and sighed in relief when she saw Mr. Grayson. She opened the door. "Oh, sorry, I'm a little on edge." Mr. Grayson nodded knowingly. "I figured as much. I heard you shouting earlier. Everything okay?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, she showed him the Polaroid. His face darkened as he studied it. "That's not right," he muttered, shaking his head. "Do you think it was them? The tenant upstairs?" Mr. Grayson hesitated before answering. "I don't know. I've lived here a long time, and I've never seen them do anything like this. But I'll tell you one thing, whoever's up there isn't like the rest of us." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her throat dry. He glanced toward the ceiling as though the tenant might overhear. "There's something off about them. Always has been. I hear strange things at night, too. And sometimes it feels like they're watching me, even though I know they never leave their room." Emily shivered. "Be careful, Emily," he added. "And if you want my advice, don't go knocking on their door again." Emily took Mr. Grayson's words to heart, but her curiosity got the better of her. The next day, she decided to do some digging. She searched online for any records about the house or its tenants. Most of what she found was Montana property tax records, old newspaper articles about renovations. That one detail stood out. About 10 years ago, there had been a fire in the building. The top floor apartment had sustained significant damage, and it had been months before anyone moved back in. Curious, she dug deeper, searching for any mention of the fire's cause. What she found made her skin crawl. An article from a local news site detailed the tragedy. A young woman named Sylvia had died in the blaze. Her body was found in the upstairs apartment, though the cause of the fire was never determined. Neighbors claimed to have heard her screaming for help, but by the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. Emily stared at the article, the pieces clicking into place. Sylvia's death had been ruled accidental, but what if the tenant upstairs knew something about it? Or worse, what if Sylvia had never truly left? That night, Emily was awoken by a soft tapping sound. At first, she thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but then she realized it was coming from her front door. Her heart raced as she crept toward the door. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Slowly, she opened the door, her breath catching in her throat. Another Polaroid lay on the floor. This one was of her kitchen, taken through the window. Emily slammed the door shut, locking it and bolting it for good measure. She backed away, clutching the photo tightly. For the first time, she truly considered leaving the apartment, but a stubborn part of her refused to run. She needed answers about the tenant, about the photographs, about whatever was happening in this house. Around midnight, Emily heard footsteps above her, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, as though someone were stomping on the floor. She frowned, listening intently. Then, the sound stopped. Moments later, she heard the faint creak of her apartment door. Someone was standing in the hallway. Emily grabbed her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed 911. But before she could press the call button, a soft knock echoed through the apartment. The knock didn't come from the front door. It came from her bedroom closet. The knock on Emily's bedroom closet door frowned her in place. She stood in the middle of her apartment, phone still in hand, staring toward the darkened hallway that led to her room. The sound came again, soft but deliberate. Her mind raced. There's no way someone could have gotten in. The windows are locked. The front door is bolted. She took a step back, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. For a fleeting moment, She thought she might be imagining things. And the knock came again, louder this time. She gripped her phone tighter and forced herself to move. Slowly, she crept down the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. The hallway was darker than it should have been. The faint glow from her living room lamp seemed to stop abruptly, swallowed by a shadow that stretched out from her bedroom door. When she reached the closet, she hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness inside impenetrable. She raised a shaking hand and pushed it open. The closet was empty. She exhaled shakily, relief flooding her body, but as she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something on the floor. She looked down and saw a Polaroid lying face up. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was another picture of her apartment, but this one was different. It showed her, standing in the living room, taken from the perspective of the hallway. Emily dropped the photograph and backed away, her chest tightening. Whoever had taken this picture had been inside her apartment. The next morning, Emily went to the police. She brought the photographs, explaining everything: noises, the tenant upstairs, the fire, and the feeling that someone was watching her. The officers at the desk, a weary-looking man in his 50s, listened patiently, but when she mentioned the tenant, he raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about the top-floor unit at 112 Westfield?" he asked. Emily nodded. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're not the first person to complain about that place. We've had a few calls over the years, strange noises, lights flickering, things like that, but every time we check, we don't find anything." "What about the tenant?" Emily pressed. The officer sighed. "The landlord says they're quiet, pay their rent on time, and don't cause trouble. Legally, there's not much we can do unless there's evidence of a crime." "What about the photographs?" "We'll file a report," he said, taking them from her, "but without proof of who took them, our hands are tied." Emily left the station feeling no safer than when she arrived. That evening, Emily knocked on Mr. Grayson's door. When he opened it, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to know what you're not telling me about the tenant upstairs," she said. Mr. Grayson's expression darkened. He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. His apartment was cluttered but cozy, filled with old furniture and the smell of coffee. He gestured for her to sit, then poured them both a cup. "There's not much I can say that you don't already know," he began, sitting across from her. "But I will tell you this, whoever or whatever is up there, they've been here longer than me, and I've been in this building for 20 years. Emily frowned. "But the fire happened 10 years ago." Mr. Grayson nodded. "That's when it got worse. Before the fire, the tenant was strange but quiet. Afterward, well, let's just say I started hearing things I couldn't explain." "Like what?" "Voices," he said, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Footsteps in the middle of the night. And once, just after the fire, I swear I saw someone staring at me from the upstairs window, except the place was supposed to be empty." Emily shivered. "You should leave," Mr. Grayson said bluntly. "This place isn't safe." Ignoring Mr. Grayson's advice, Emily decided to confront the tenant once and for all. She couldn't leave like this, jumping at every sound, fearing every shadow. That night, she marched upstairs, her flashlight and phone in hand. She banged on the door. "I'm not leaving until you talk to me," she shouted. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, she heard the lock click. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened room. The smell of mildew and something faintly metallic wafted out. "Hello," Emily called, stepping inside. The apartment was colder than it should have been. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse and old. A single chair Saturday in the middle of the room, facing a window covered by heavy curtains. As she moved deeper into the room, she noticed something on the floor. Polaroid photographs, scattered like leaves. She knelt to pick one up, her breath catching in her throat. They were all pictures of her. Her in the kitchen, her on the couch, her sleeping in bed. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. She whirled around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged, a shadowy shape that seemed to shift and ripple as it moved. Its face was obscured, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a low rasp. Emily stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. She scrambled for the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. Just as she managed to open it, she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She screamed and bolted down the stairs, not stopping until she was safely inside her apartment. She locked the door, her entire body trembling. The next morning, Emily found another Polaroid outside her door. This one was different. It showed her standing in the upstairs apartment, holding one of the photographs. The shadowy figure stood behind her. Emily Saturday in her apartment, clutching the Polaroid with trembling hands. She couldn't stop staring at the shadowy figure looming behind her in the photograph. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was there, a tangible presence. Her mind raced. How did they take this photo? Were they in the room with me? She felt trapped. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but something stronger, an insatiable need for answers, kept her rooted in place. She couldn't live with the terror, not unless she uncovered the truth about the tenant upstairs. Emily made her decision that evening, armed with her phone, a kitchen knife, and a sense of determination she wasn't sure was bravery or foolishness. She climbed the stairs one last time. When she reached the door, she knocked softly, almost reverently. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "I just want to understand." To her surprise, the door creaked open again. This time, the room was dimly lit by a single, flickering lamp in the corner. She stepped inside cautiously, closing the door behind her. "Hello," she called out. The room was the same as before, sparse furniture, bare walls, and the faint, metallic smell. But now there was something new, a stack of Polaroids Saturday on the chair in the center of the room. Emily approached the stack, her heart pounding. She picked up the top photo and gasped. It was an image of the fire that had consumed the apartment years ago. The flames licked at the walls, thick smoke pouring from the windows. The next photo showed a young woman, Sylvia. Emily assumed standing in the doorway of the burning room, her face contorted in terror. The third photo was the most chilling. It showed Sylvia lying on the floor, her body charred, her lifeless eyes staring directly at the camera. Emily dropped the photos, her stomach churning. "You shouldn't be here," came the raspy voice again. She spun around, and there it was, shadowy figure, standing in the far corner of the room. Its form seemed to shimmer and shift, as though it were made of smoke. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, its shape began to solidify. Emily's breath caught as she recognized the face. It was Sylvia. "I can't leave," Sylvia said, her voice hollow. "And now, neither can you." Emily backed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. She twisted the handle frantically, her eyes darting back to Sylvia. "Why are you doing this?" Emily cried. Sylvia's expression was sorrowful. "I'm not doing this." "They are." Emily frowned. "They." Sylvia didn't respond, but her form began to dissolve, melting back into the shadows. Suddenly, the room began to shake. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and a low, guttural sound filled the air. Emily turned to see the shadows coalescing into something larger, something far more sinister. The darkness formed a figuretal, gaunt and featureless, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch toward her. The entity lunged, its shadowy arms reaching for Emily. She screamed, throwing herself to the side just as one of its limbs smashed into the wall. She scrambled across the floor, grabbing the fallen Polaroids and shoving them into her pocket. The entity roared, a sound that reverberated through her very bones. Emily reached the door and pounded on it desperately. "Let me out!" she screamed. To her astonishment, the door flew open, and she tumbled into the hallway. She didn't look back. She sprinted down the stairs, out of the house, and into the cold night air. Emily didn't stop running until she reached a nearby diner. She collapsed into a booth, pulling the Polaroids from her pocket. Her hands shook as she spread them out on the table. Among the images of the fire and Sylvia's death, she found one she hadn't noticed before. It was a picture of a group of people standing in the upstairs apartment, men and women in old-fashioned clothing, their faces eerily blurred. Written at the bottom in faint, spidery handwriting were the words, "We never leave." Emily's stomach churned as realization dawned. The tenant upstairs wasn't a single person. It was the collective presence of the souls trapped by the fire. Emily moved out the next day, leaving the house and its horrors behind, but the nightmares followed her. Weeks later, she drove past the house on her way to work, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. A "for rent" sign hung in the front yard, and a young couple stood on the porch, talking to Mrs. Callahan. Emily rolled down her window, her voice trembling as she called out, "Don't move in there, it's not safe." The couple turned to her, confused, but Mrs. Callahan simply smiled. "Everything's fine, dear," she said. "We've already found a new tenant for the upstairs unit." Emily's blood ran cold. She glanced toward the top floor, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a shadow in the window. watching her. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.